I told her a snippet of what I went through at 17 and what I was currently dealing with. And she looked me in the eye and she said, Susan, everything that you have been dealing with all these years since you were 17 is 100% normal.
Yes.
You have PTSD. And I sat back a little and because I was like, wait a minute, I didn't go to war. I'm not in the military. I'm not a first responder. What do you mean I have PTSD? And she said, you know what, Susan, anyone who goes through a traumatic experience can experience PTSD. And what you need to know is that PTSD does not go away. You learn to manage it. And it was like, I describe it all the time. It's like the sky opened up and rainbows shot out because I finally had answers.
Hello, my lovelies. Welcome to the beautiful side of grief, where you get to hear from those who have faced unimaginable grief and come through that to share with you their insights and tools of how they've found love, happiness, and beauty on the other side. I'm so grateful you're listening in today, and I'm sending so much love your way. There's grief, there's trauma, and then there's traumatic grief. And that's what we're covering on today's episode. My guest is Susan Snow, and she is the daughter of a Los Angeles police detective who was ambushed and killed on Halloween night back in 1985 while picking up his then 6-year-old son from school. But worse was to come. Both she and her mother were called to the school where they witnessed both the body and the aftermath. 5 years ago, Susan undertook the painful task of reliving these events over and over to write her book, The Other Side of the Gun, My Journey from Trauma to Resiliency. So we're going to take a look at the devastating effects trauma and PTSD have on a person's life, how you can recognize those signs, and then find a way to heal. Susan speaks all over the country, sharing her story, promoting her book, as well as being a coach. Susan, welcome to the beautiful side of grief, and congratulations on the recent wedding of your son.
Oh, thank you so much. Wow. Yeah, that was quite the intro.
You're welcome. You're worth it.
Thank you so much.
I thought we'd kick this off with you sharing a special memory of your dad and why that memory is so special.
Oh my gosh, there are so many great memories of my dad. The one thing I can say about my dad, and I've talked about this before, is that my dad was the type of person that was present and always made you feel like you were the most important thing in the room. And that's the kind of father he always was. Even as I got older, he was always someone that I could be honest with, and he would listen to me with no judgment.
Wow.
And that was important for me because I really had a lot of respect for him because of that.
Wow.
And he also scared the bejeebers out of me. Just, he could make me fess up to anything.
I guess those were the tools of his trade, weren't they, being a detective in the police department?
Exactly. But he also had humor. He had a lot of humor, and he made me laugh a lot as a kid.
Those are really special qualities. And I was going to ask you, how would you describe yourself pre your dad's death? Because I just want to then compare what happened to you afterward, if that's okay.
Oh, no, that's fine. I think I was 17 and I was a typical teenager just trying to find my way. Mm-hmm. I really was quiet as a kid. And around 15, 16, I had heard of this modeling school and it intrigued me. And I told my parents about it, and we went and took a look at it, and they thought it would be a great idea to bring me out of my shyness. And then it backfired
Oh, how did it backfire?
because I actually loved it.
Oh.
I kind of came out of this shyness and bloomed a little bit. And I think my dad wasn't ready for the blooming part. I had really struggled with my weight as a kid and as a young teenager. And I dropped a bunch of weight and I colored my hair blonde. And then all of a sudden I was doing professional photography shoots. And I wasn't sure if my dad was quite ready for the butterfly to come out yet. Yeah.
And probably no
Uh,
doubt the attention that you were receiving with that.
yeah. I mean, I met my now husband during that time when I was 16. And I was almost 17 when I met him. But the fact that I had the confidence that I had because of the modeling and things that I would do, I was able to go into this relationship with this boy. um, but he was older, and I had dated a guy prior that tried to give my dad a beer, a Foster's Lager beer,
Oh.
and he was underage. Yeah. So that blew it for me because he said, you can't date anyone unless they're your age, because this guy was also 19. But when I met my husband, he had a baby face. So he looked my age. And we never told him
Wait,
when we started dating.
as you do as teenagers, as you do.
Yeah. Yeah. What he didn't know wouldn't hurt him. So, yeah, he didn't find out until right before he was killed.
Yeah.
He found out the age of my boyfriend. But by then, they liked each other. He liked him, and
Yeah,
it was fine.
that's good. How would you compare that Susan that you've just described with the Susan post your dad's death and what you experienced with that? How did it affect you?
Oh, I was a totally different person. After my dad was killed, and I went through all of that, I was really struggling. And unfortunately, my mom abandoned me a bit at that
Was
time.
that,
And
can I just
yeah.
ask, was that because she was having difficulty facing what had happened to herself?
Yeah, I think that had a lot I think that had a lot to do with it. Everybody deals with grief and trauma
Mhm.
differently. The night my dad was killed, she chose to send me with a neighbor.
Mm.
And that was really hard because even though I didn't want to be at that school, I didn't want to be there. I wanted to know where my brother was. I wanted to be with my mom. I wanted to be with the unit. And I wasn't given that chance
Mm.
and had to try to navigate all the things that I had seen that night and all the emotions that were flooding in on my own. And that was very difficult. On the other side of that, my dad was my best friend, and this was a huge story when it happened, and the media was all over us from the get-go. So it took them a few days to figure out he had a teenage daughter. So it was hard. It was frustrating. I felt alienated and alone. And being a kid myself, I just didn't know I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to get out of bed. I didn't sleep for an entire year after my dad was killed. And so unbeknownst to me, I had PTSD. I just didn't know I had PTSD at the time. All I knew is that I was suicidal. I just dreamt of being with my dad all the time. I'd make lists in my head of ways that I would take my own life. But at the same time, because I was a kid, I didn't understand the finality of that. And in the 80s, there was no talk of mental health. There was no talk of PTSD, and there were no resources for children at that time. And so it was a lot of learning to hide behind a mask and pretend that everything was fine and I was okay, but I was a mess inside.
Gosh.
And I didn't know anything about therapy then. LAPD, about a month after my dad was killed, they came to my mother and said that they would pay for us to go. And my mom said we should go, and I just followed the lead. In my mind, back then, I thought, oh gosh, if someone has to see a therapist, they're crazy. But I followed the lead. I was told what to do, and I did what I was told. So I did see this gentleman. And honestly, I think in hindsight, he wasn't really prepared or educated enough to handle the extreme trauma of it. And so our sessions were very shallow. And the questions that he asked were just about my relationship with my mother, my brother, my boyfriend, and school. Not once did he ask me how that night affected me. There was no question that would lead me into being vulnerable enough to tell him all the things that were swirling around in my head and the anxiety I was feeling every day. I felt unsafe. I felt anxiety of my mom started drinking and being around alcoholism and all those things that came up, we never talked about. For an entire year, I saw this man, and every week I would think to myself, gosh, this is going to be the week. This is going to be it. He's going to fix me. It's going to happen. And for a year, I did that. And at the end of the year, he said, Susan, you're a well-rounded young lady and you're strong and you're going to be fine for the rest of your life.
Oh my gosh.
And I was like, wait a minute.
Yeah. Hello.
I don't know what to deal with all these emotions. I don't know what to do. I don't have any adults who are guiding me or helping me navigate this. So what do I do? And then I took on the mindset that I must be broken. And I'm just going to be like this for the rest of my life. I must just be crazy. And this is just how it's going to be. Mm. And I lived in that for 14 years of my life. And in hindsight, and when I talk about it in the book, is I feel like it stole and robbed a lot of living from me because I wasn't healing. I wasn't dealing with it. I wore a mask that nobody could see what was going on with me. And I walked around like that for 14 years. And then we moved from Southern California to Colorado in 1997. And this time, my boyfriend and I were married, still are, and I had 2 children. And in 99, Columbine happened.
Yeah.
And I was working as a hairdresser at the time. That day, I had a client in my chair. I put her under a dryer, went to the back room where we had this little tiny TV, and I turned it on, and all the coverage was on there. And I had some colleagues that were standing next to me, and I literally started having flashbacks. And I saw the kids that were about my same age, and I saw the police everywhere, and I saw the ambulances, and everything that I saw the night of my dad's death was right in front of me. And I started to sweat. I was having a panic attack. I turned pale as a ghost. And my colleagues looked at me and said, "Are you okay? Do you have any kids there? Do you live in that neighborhood?" And I said, "I don't know what's happening to me. I don't understand why I'm reacting this way." And again, I got myself together. I put my mask on.
Mm-hmm.
I went out. I did my clients for the day. I left, walked out the door, and all of those old emotions came flooding back. And as I was driving home, I would picture myself driving off a cliff, off the road, hitting a tree, whatever it was. Like I had a plan. And I tried to hide it. I thought I was slick. I tried to hide it from my husband, but he's too smart. And he met me at the door one day and he said, "You have two choices. You either get help or I'm putting you in a hospital." And I said, "Okay, I'll get help. I'm a mom. I'm scared. I'm scared of what I might do to myself." So I got help. I went to the doctor. They put me on antidepressants because that's what they do. And the next thing he said was, "And you need to see a therapist." And I thought, "Oh, you're kidding me."
Here we go again.
Here we
Round
go.
2.
Didn't help me 14 years ago. I don't know what you think it's going to do now, but okay, I'll go. And I went and saw this female therapist, and she specialized in PTSD.
Oh, wow.
Thank God. The first session, I told her a snippet of what I went through at 17 and what I was currently dealing with. And she looked me in the eye and she said, "Susan, everything that you have been dealing with all these years since you were 17 is 100% normal.
Yes.
You have PTSD." And I sat back a little and because I was like, wait a minute, I didn't go to war. I'm not in the military. I'm not a first responder. What do you mean I have PTSD? And she said, "You know what, Susan, anyone who goes through a traumatic experience can experience PTSD. And what you need to know is that PTSD does not go away. You learn to manage it." And it was like, I describe it all the time. It's like the sky opened up and rainbows shot out because I finally had answers for the first time in 14 years. And I really was grateful. And that doctor was like, "You need to see a therapist." That I didn't try to like fix myself.
I'm so glad you had your husband by your side as well, because
Oh
really he was aware of what you'd gone through the first time around and probably knew that you'd lost that happiness, that joyfulness that you'd had when he first met you, and still loved you exactly as you were, even if you felt you were broken. He certainly didn't see that, but stood by you. And Yeah, wow. Thank goodness that he recognized the
Oh,
effects
yeah.
of
He saved my
Columbine.
life.
Yes, beautiful.
He saved my life. And this woman saved my life. We dove in right away. And the first thing she did with me, which was like, I thought, oh, okay, this is really going to help. But it was journaling.
Yes.
And I was like such a skeptic about it. But she said journaling can be different things. So some people like to write, some people write music or play music or art. There's different ways, but it all is the same. You're getting what is swirling around in your head out. So it literally trains the brain. It's a tool. And I didn't even realize that it was a tool until I started to use it. And I started to realize because I was not sleeping. I don't think I had a really good night's sleep in 14 years.
Yeah.
And I started to sleep because every time before I would lay down, my brain would turn on. And all of these things and thoughts and dark places, and it would just all come flooding in, and I couldn't sleep, or I'd be terrified to sleep.
And did you find that also just perpetuated the whole cycle? Because if you're not getting enough sleep or not getting enough good sleep, then you wake up and you're not at your best the next day. And so you're continually going around and around in a circle, depriving yourself. I don't know how you survived that long. Gosh.
I don't either, to be honest. When I look at it, hindsight, I was like, holy cow, I literally was a zombie. I walked around with rose-colored glasses. I actually have one of my chapters. I didn't see things for what they were because I couldn't.
Yeah.
And so I surrounded myself with not so great relationships.
Yeah.
And I allowed behavior to slide. I didn't speak up for myself. I hid in the background. And so it was just difficult. It was just really hard. And so as I started this journey, she introduced me to cognitive therapies. Because anxiety was a big thing for me. Waking up in panic attacks in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
I felt like I was out of control. And I hated it. And especially being a mom. Moms are supposed to be stoic. Moms are supposed to be strong. Moms are supposed to not lose their, what. And my kids are seeing it. They're seeing mom like crying in the corner and losing it. And I hated that. I hated that. And so when she started to introduce the tapping techniques, using affirmation, when I was peaked with my anxiety, she would teach me how to bring my state down to calmness. And that was huge.
Was that via tapping or was that breath work?
It was both.
It was both.
Yeah, it was both. Yes. So learning the breathing techniques, and she didn't want to throw me into everything all at once. So we just little by little went into things one after another. Now, one thing she kept asking and telling me about was EMDR.
Yes, yes.
But she did not do EMDR. She knew somebody that did it and referred me. And she had told me, she said, this is where it gets intense.
Can you just explain what EMDR is for those listeners that may not be familiar?
So EMDR is a technique where there's different ways that different doctors do it. My own experience was using these electronic paddles. And the therapist first showed started off with my happy place. So I had to go to my happy place and relax my body as much as possible. And then she would start to put me in that space that night. She would have me describe what I saw. And what would happen is, as I was describing it, the pulses would go back and forth. And so it was like my brain was like, wait, I'm trying to remember these thoughts, but I'm being disturbed by these pulses. And so what it does is it's a retraining of your brain to not go into a panic mode, to not go into the fear and feel out of control. And if I did start to feel that way, she would pull me back out and put me in my happy place. So I should have continued with sessions. It's a very difficult thing to do. And
difficult in what way?
Because when you're being put in that state of mind, you're almost afraid that you're never going to come back out of it.
Oh.
Even though you have a professional there with you, there's still some fear around it. And so back then, I was still in the middle of my journey. I was still in the middle of my healing. So there was still a lot of what ifs in my head. Those what ifs they're not there anymore. Thank God.
Do you think that was your ego kicking in and trying to keep you into that same state, that same place? Because even though it wasn't a nice place to be, it was a familiar place. It was a place that you knew. Yeah. And then you were going into unknown, uncharted territory for yourself, weren't you?
Absolutely.
Oh.
Yeah. It was just terrifying knowing that I was going to be this vulnerable with someone else.
Yeah.
And now I trusted this woman, but at the same time, you got to trust yourself.
Can we just explore that a little bit more? Because I think that is so vitally important in being able to actually share your story. So if you're not with a therapist or a counselor or whoever it may be that you're seeking support from, if you're not feeling comfortable with them, say perhaps you did with your first counselor, then you don't open up, do you? You just keep everything trapped inside. So
Absolutely.
So that trust really needs to be in place very early on for you to allow yourself to go to those vulnerable places, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And that's something that I tell people right now is that because I've been around this conversation where people say, my insurance sends me to this person. And so I feel obligated or I feel like I have to stay with that person. And I tell people this all the time. If you aren't connecting with that therapist, your healing will not happen.
Yes.
Because you have to have that trust. You have to have that connection in order to be able to be vulnerable enough to really do the work. And if you don't, then your work is going to be for none, right? You're not going to have the healing that you seek. And that's why a lot of people get frustrated and they think therapy doesn't work. And they back out of it. I've talked to a million people about this. And so I tell people, if you honestly look at it as a partnership and you go in and you interview your therapist and you feel connected to that person, then you're with the right person. If you interview them and you don't feel, and you'll know in the first session, you will know whether you've connected with that person or not. If you don't, Move on
Yeah.
until you find one that does.
And that's actually part of what they sign up to is getting that connection established first and foremost. And if they don't establish it, then they have an obligation to refer you on to somebody else who can do that.
Exactly.
But a lot of that doesn't happen. And like you said, for
No.
monetary reasons, insurance companies covering or picking up the tab. But there's also another point that I think is really interesting too in all of this. That first counselor you spoke to, I remember David Kessler sharing a story, and I look, and it's very vague. I haven't got all the details perhaps exact, but I remember him sharing this story about speaking to a fellow therapist who didn't know anything about grief at all. And he was sharing with David about seeing this lady, and David said, "Oh, are you trained in grief?" And like that. And the guy said, "No, oh no, she'll be all right. We'll just." But the importance of that was that if you are not specialized in grief or in trauma or in both, then you're not necessarily going to know how to best tease out and do the work that's necessary to get somebody like yourself back to that really beautiful space again. Would you agree?
Yes, totally agree. And I know that it's a frustration for a lot of people, especially kids, especially young adults.
Mm,
I have young adult children, and I have told them this. If they're in therapy, and I tell them, if you don't feel comfortable with this therapist, move on
yeah,
and find someone that is. I do talk to people about whatever it is that you're dealing with, whether it's addiction, grief, trauma, whatever. Make sure that your therapist specializes in those points, because otherwise it might be too much for them. They might not have the education around it in order to guide you or navigate you through what you need to heal. Yeah, it is an important conversation to have, for sure.
yeah. So it's not just about liking the person, it's also about ensuring that they are trained to be able to
Mhm.
deal with what you need to
Mhm.
deal with. Yeah. Yeah. Very good points.
And that's all a part of the interviewing part.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love that.
Find out what kind of education they've had.
Yeah. And people are so afraid to do that with professionals, aren't they? We're brought up to
Yeah.
not question them. They're the ones with the
Mm-mm.
degree. So we just need
Right.
to trust them. But how often has that turned out not very well?
Exactly.
Yep.
Exactly.
Yeah. I think we're in a time, though, where I think with that we can change the narrative around that. And I think this is why conversations like you and I are having right here, right now, are so vitally important. And it's to empower people to be able to seek what is ultimately the best for them, because we have so much conditioning and
Oh gosh, yeah.
self-beliefs that don't necessarily work in our
Absolutely.
favor. Yeah. And I'd like to just draw out on a point too, because Dr. Gabor Mate, when he speaks about his work, when you were talking about what you were going through after your dad and all those horrific feelings that you were just suppressing and the masks you were putting on.
Mhm.
And I remember him describing that as normal responses to an abnormal emotional or social circumstances or events. And
Right.
actually, you're not broken at all. You're actually
No.
very normal.
Yeah.
And yes, but you just didn't have the right people around you at the time to support you through that. So, how did it manifest in your look? You've alluded to your mum. She used alcohol to help her cope through that time. But what about your
Mhm.
brother? How did it manifest for your brother?
My brother, he had a lot of self-sabotaging
Mhm.
type behavior. He got himself into some trouble,
Mhm.
drugs. He's an addict. And we really didn't have a relationship for a really long time because of the choices that he was making. I couldn't be around it. And I think the hardest part was that I depended on my mom's view of things since she was the adult. And there were a lot of things that I was not aware of until 5 years ago.
Yeah.
We've since we're healing our relationship. We've healed our relationship. He's doing amazing. He's in his journey right now. You're never too old,
Yeah.
right? So he too has gone through good therapists and bad therapists, and he's got a great one now. And my brother has had stackable trauma throughout his life and things that he has seen.
Let's
So
just clarify that definition, stackable trauma. Tell us what you mean by that.
So basically, he has experienced different traumas throughout his life as a young man. And when you have an initial trauma, anything else that happens after that starts to stack up. And if you're not dealing with the initial trauma, it just gets out of hand. It gets way overwhelming and you shut down, which is what happened. My brother, he had survivor's guilt. Even though he was 6 years old, his little brain told him he could have saved his daddy.
Oh, yeah.
Which is a normal response for a child. But we both had very complicated relationships with my mother. And so my brother spent many years feeling like he was one man on an island. And I spent many years thinking I was one woman on an island. And then 5 years ago, we realized that we were both on that same island.
Yeah. What brought you to that point 5 years ago? Because that's when you started writing your book, wasn't it?
Writing my book.
And why did you
yes.
decide to do that just before we go into that?
I turned 50. I don't know what it is about 50, but I literally woke up one day and said, I'm not playing around anymore. Like, I'm drawing a line in the sand. I felt like my book, I was writing it for myself, but I was also writing it for him in my way, because I was not able to be the sister that he needed all those years. It was my way of being the sister that he needed.
Oh, that's beautiful.
When I wrote it, I knew that at some point he would read it. We have to be very careful because he has seizures when he's triggered emotionally. And I want to make sure that I don't trigger him to have seizures. So even today, I'm not sure if he's read the book yet or even snippets. His wife has. And his therapist wants to read it before he reads it so she can walk him through some things, which I totally agree.
Yeah.
But I think when I told him I was writing a book is what opened up the conversation about what it was that I was writing about. And we sat back and we started to talk about certain times in our lives and what his experiences were as opposed to what my experiences were, and comparing notes, so to speak.
And there were 10 to 11 years between you.
Yes, he's 10 years younger than me.
Exactly. So that's a big age difference.
It is a big age difference. And I moved out at 18. I had to. Unbeknownst to me, it was for my mental health. And I left him at 8. And he had to experience some things with me not around.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really difficult. He saw how tumultuous my relationship was with my mother, and it was hard for him. As a little boy,
Yeah.
he wanted to protect me, but he was too little and he couldn't.
Mm.
He felt helpless. But he understands why I moved out. He totally understands that. He understands the night that I made that decision and why I made that decision. So I think the fact that I allowed him to tell his story to me was healing.
Yes.
He didn't have to hold it in anymore. And he could be honest with me about his experiences and what he went through, just in different things in his life. And he knows that I knew what he was up to, even though he didn't think I knew what he was up to. So I've always had that with him. And our relationship now is really close, and I'm very grateful that I still have him and am able to talk to him. And he is, even though he hasn't read my book, or if he has read my book, he's still one of my biggest supporters, and he's proud. And I think in writing the book and having the repercussions, because there are repercussions when you put yourself out there like that, he's very protective of me. And
what are some of the repercussions that you've faced doing that?
My mom and I no longer have a relationship.
Okay, yeah.
In telling my truth, I had to tell hers.
Mm.
And unfortunately, my mom is a narcissist, and I didn't even realize that until I wrote the book. A lot of things came to me. I had repressed memories, and I just realized that, oh my gosh, our relationship was like, I made a lot of excuses. I did a lot of hiding. I never spoke up for myself until I got a little bit older.
Yeah.
I took a lot of the abuse. And she was a narcissist before the alcohol came, but when the alcohol came, it was intense.
Yeah. Thank you for being so vulnerable and sharing that with us, because that's a difficult thing to say about your mum. You don't want to think of your mum like that. And
I don't.
Yeah.
And I didn't write this book to make her out to be some kind of evil person. Like I said, everybody deals with grief and everybody deals with trauma differently. And that's the route that she took, was of the victim. And she still lives in that today. So it's hard for me because I have fought that mentality, whether I knew it or not, since I was 17.
Yes.
I hate the word victim.
Yep.
And my brother and her took that route. And my brother is now in the mentality of the survivor, but my mom is stuck. And there just comes a time where you have to sit back and realize that it's a healthier situation for you and your family and for your mental well-being to not have a relationship with someone who's toxic. And it is hard to say that my mom is a toxic person. I don't like to say that, but it is what it is. And
I understand that as well. That's what I had to do with my mum. In order to survive, I had to just take myself away from the situation. I
Yeah.
ran. I went overseas. I did a lot of running in my early years, and it's only in hindsight that I can see the situation for what it
What you were
was.
actually
Yes,
doing.
exactly. So I do understand
Yeah.
that. Let's talk now about the concept of forgiveness because, I love that. And I love that you think like I think, that it comes from within and it's all about you.
Yeah, it's not an easy thing. I have this conversation with people all the time because of the myth around forgiveness. And what I tell people is that for me personally, finding forgiveness was not an easy feat at all. But what I realized is that I was forgiving for myself. And in doing that, I was taking my power back from the people who hurt me.
Yeah, for not knowing any
I
better
was
at the
taking my
time.
power back.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because the other side of that is I watched my mom live with all this hatred and anger, and I didn't want to live my life that way. I feel like when you walk around with all of that in your heart, it steals something from your soul.
Yeah.
And I feel like for myself, I didn't want that. I never wanted that. But at the same time, I had no idea how I was going to find the strength to forgive. And I talk about it in my book, but it's actually funny how that happened.
Yeah, share it with us.
So my husband and I, we split up for a while. We did divorce and we came back together. My husband, there was infidelity in the relationship. And in hindsight, I had to forgive him for that as well. And I'll get into that later, but learning to forgive, I wanted to so badly. And after he and I got back together, I felt like the universe was moving me in a positive direction. And I was still healing. I was still in therapy. And one night for one of our dates, we watched Passion of the Christ. And mind you, neither one of us are really religious people, but we were like, let's just watch that movie, shall we?
Okay.
And I watched the scene of Jesus and the day he was crucified, and I thought, holy cow, if a human being can go through all of that horrific torture and find forgiveness in his heart for the people that were doing it to him, then I can find forgiveness for the men that took my dad's life.
Wow.
And I can find forgiveness for the husband who hurt me. And I can find forgiveness for the mother who abandoned me emotionally. And I just sat on the floor, or we both did, and cried our eyes out because it was such a turning
Oh,
point for
that's what
me.
just came to my head. Massive turning point. Yeah.
Massive turning point for me. And I sat back and I went, wow, I just took my power back.
And that is
And it was huge.
such an incredible feeling, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. Light and airy.
Yeah. And so how many years ago was that? Because, to achieve that in your life is truly a turning point. Because I think
Yeah.
from that point going forward, it just opens so many other doors, positive doors. Yeah, it doesn't mean that you still don't have healing and work to do, but it's on a whole different level, isn't it?
Yeah, that was 2006.
Wow. Well done, you.
Crazy, huh? So anyways, yeah. And that's what I tell people when they say, how could you forgive? Even my own mother feels the same way. How could you forgive? You're slapping your father in the face when you do that. No, I'm not. Nope. Nope. I am not. It's like telling those men, you didn't win. You did not win.
Yeah.
You might have won with my mother. You might have won a little bit with my brother, but you did not win with me. And there's a freedom in that. And I feel like I was telling a friend of mine, that's my superpower.
Your friend?
Yeah. I told my friend, I have a superpower.
You,
I take my power back.
and I agree with you, because in 2 days' time, there is a young man that's going to stand trial for taking the life of somebody very special to me, who had only just had the opportunity to get to meet and get to know, and his life was taken. And I just thought, actually, I don't need to go down. I don't need to be a part of that, because I'm not going to give you any of my power. You've taken his life. Nothing can change that now, but you're not going to have anything more. And I feel quite at peace for that, but it's very difficult for others to understand that.
Oh, sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
Everybody's trauma is not the
Yeah.
same. And so, I wish this for people, though. I wish that they could find forgiveness. And there are acts in this world and there is evil in this world that it is just hard to wrap your head around forgiving someone that would do something so horrific. However, if you live in that hatred, you're giving them your power.
Yes. I always like to think also is that we have no idea what has happened to that person to get them to that point. All people
hurt.
Yes. And the more that we can just find the love and the light and the ability to forgive and the compassion within ourselves and share that with others, hopefully, it may not seem much, but I think it's very powerful and it helps.
And those people will pay their penance.
Yeah.
Those people, what I used to think about to go to bed was the fact that when those men meet their maker, they'll have to explain themselves.
Yeah.
They'll have to deal with that. And I have no control over that.
Nope.
What I have control over is my own self and how I think and my mindset. That's what I have control over. I don't have control over anything else. And I got to that point because one of the men that was involved was actually released in 2017. And at that point, he had done 32 years in prison. He was the youngest defendant out of all of them. And there were 3 that were convicted. And I hoped that he would have remorse, which I don't think he does. But for years and years, like, he would come up for parole every 3 to 5 years, every 3 to 5 years, every 3 to 5 years. And after a while, it's like when you're in a healing journey, you want to just keep moving forward. The complication to that would be, as soon as he'd come up for parole, my mom would be in my face to write letters like, you need to write a letter and you need to do this and you need to do that. And that was coming from all that hatred and that anger in her. And she wanted me to feel the same way. And I didn't.
Yeah.
But if I didn't, then I heard, oh, that's you're disrespecting your father, right? When I knew that he was going to be released, And there was nothing that I can do about it. There was not a letter that I could write that was going to stop it. I had to accept that he was going to get out. And in accepting that, what I realized was that I can keep moving forward.
Yeah.
And I actually found some happiness in that. Now, I would never tell my mother I found happiness in that, but I did. I found happiness in the fact that for the first time in my life, I can just continue to move forward and nothing was going to yank me backwards.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. That's incredible. What an incredible story you have, Susan. And I'm so pleased that you are sharing this because there are so many learnings for us out of this. Is there anything else? Because I'm just aware we're just heading towards that sort of conclusion. Is there anything else that you would like our listeners to know that perhaps we haven't got around to sharing or talking about?
I think the most important thing, especially when you're going through grief, is grace and understanding that you're going to have good days and you're going to have bad days, and that's okay. It's okay to have good days and bad days.
Yeah.
It's a part of the healing process. But when you're feeling it, feel it. Don't stuff it. Don't put your mask on. Don't pretend everything is all right, because it's not. And the more you stuff it, it's going to come flying back at you.
Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah. So, just know that you're not alone
Mhm.
and that you have to give yourself some grace. Even writing my book, I had to give myself some grace because there were days I couldn't function. I was at my, I just had nothing in the till. I had no gas to go anymore.
Yeah.
And I had to give myself a day. And those are days that I would do something for myself specifically. So if you have those days, find something that brings you joy.
Mhm.
And I tell my kids this too. On those really gloomy, sad, yucky days, turn it around and do something for yourself that's positive, that gives you joy.
I love that. And I also want to know how you feel inside now that you've gone through that healing, that you've been through all those sessions with your person that dealt with your PTSD and just writing that book. How do you, and having grace for people, that is so beautiful. The forgiveness and having grace, how does that make you feel inside now as a person?
I'll give you an example.
Yeah, I love that.
I have come full circle. My husband and I went into California back in July, and I had a book signing and a speaking thing that I did. And while we were there, obviously I wanted to go to the cemetery to go see Dad, spruce him up a bit. His marker was a mess. And I had a couple conversations with him. And I said, I was driving. I had the rental car, and I told my husband, before we get on the plane, I want to go to the school because there is a placard on the street sign. It has my dad's name, badge. LAPD decided to do this on all the streets where police officers are killed in the line of duty.
Mm-hmm.
It's in the front of the school, and my dad was killed on the back side of the school on Glade. And so we went and we saw the placard and we took pictures. And anytime I went anywhere near that school, the skin would crawl. Like I would start to feel that anxious feeling. I would start to cry. I felt awful. And this time I was at peace.
Wow.
I looked at my husband and I said, I want to go one more place before we leave. And he had no idea what I was talking about. He just was like, okay. So we got in the car and I started to drive down the street and I started to turn right on the street that connects the back side of the school and the front of the school. And at that point, he was like, "What are you doing? Where are we going? What are we doing?" And I was like, "Just give me a minute." And I drove to Glade and I turned right on the street and I drove up the street, turned the car around and sat there. And I started to describe to my husband everything I saw that night, where my dad's truck was, where the ambulance was, where we came out of. And he sat and he listened to me. And there was not 1 ounce of my being that felt anxious. I was completely at peace.
Oh, that's brought tears to my eyes. That is so beautiful. And your dad would just be so proud of you. So proud of everything
I
you've
know he
done,
was there.
Susan.
Yeah, thank
Oh,
you.
that is such a brave thing
So
to
that was my litmus test. That was I have a tagline, bulldoze your fear.
do.
That was me bulldozing my fear. And as I sat there and I felt at peace, I was so proud of myself
Yeah.
for the first time. And I thought, wow, this is an incredible feeling. So when you ask me, I will say that I am at peace.
Beautiful.
And I'm hoping to be able to help others find that peace.
Oh, it's a great mission. Just before we wrap up, I've got some questions I'd love to ask you that I always finish off
Sure.
with. What is the best thing that has happened to you so far today?
Oh my gosh. Today, actually,
Mm-hmm.
today. Oh, today. So I drive for Lyft part time.
Mm-hmm.
And I had an incredible conversation with a young man who was in town from another state. I have a book in my car and he saw it and we started to talk about mental health and he was able to tell me something that he went through as a young man. And I obviously told my story and there was a real connection there. It happens all the time. When you live in your purpose, this
Yep.
happens. But I made his ride to the airport something that he was not expecting. And he actually hugged me when I dropped him off and I gave him my book. And I feel so grateful to be able to make a dent, to make a difference in someone's life in a short ride in my car.
Oh, and you may never know how you've changed his life by just what you've said and the chills I got. I imagine that you've changed his life significantly, and that just makes it all worthwhile, doesn't it? Oh,
Oh, yeah,
what
absolutely.
is something that you are most grateful for?
Oh my gosh. I am grateful for my husband. He is my best friend. We've been together 38 years. He knows me better than I know myself sometimes. And my beautiful children. They're all grown and they're adults. And my middle son got married last weekend. And watching him be in love with his now wife was one of the best days for me. I just sat in it. I just felt it. And it was an incredible experience.
Ah, and I imagine that you are now just the most wonderful mirror for them, what you're reflecting back for them to be able to use in their own lives going forward. And whenever they come a little bit unstuck, they just need to look at their mum. know what
I hope
she's
so.
done and see that you can.
We all try to do that as parents.
Yeah.
Hopefully something sticks. But my kids are amazing human beings, and I am very proud of the young people that they are.
Wonderful. And when you have moments in your day that are not going so well and they turn to custard, what is your go-to?
Oh my gosh. Affirmation. Affirmations are so important for your mindset. And generally, if you start with an affirmation in the morning or you start with a lot of times I will start with gratitude
Mhm.
and really remind myself of what I need to be grateful for. And it really does change your mindset. It really does.
Changes your
So,
life.
3 things that are grateful for every day
Yeah.
can really change.
Ah, yes. Lady after my own heart there. Okay, so we're going to have all the links of how people can get in touch with you in the episode notes, but I'd love for you just to share how they can do that right here and right now.
I have a website. It's susansnowspeaks.com. I also have I'm on Instagram. It's just my name, and Facebook as well. My book is available on Amazon, and it is in paperback form, but I also have a Kindle form as well. Before the end of the year, I will have an audiobook. That has just been a little bit of a because I'm doing it myself. I will be reading my own book. My oldest is going to help me with that. But yeah, so those are through the website. If you feel like you wanted to talk to me personally, there is a link in there where you can contact me and I will return any emails.
Yeah, well done you. Susan, what an incredible experience that you've lived through, both at the time and through the years with your healing journey as you've dealt with all of this and your family circumstances. And I love that you are called now to help others with navigating their own grief and trauma and traumatic grief. Because who better than somebody who already knows that road and has traveled it? So what you're doing out in the world is very much needed, and you're a shining light for people. So just carry on being your beautiful self. And
thank you so much.
Thank you so much for taking the time to be with me and speak with me today.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening. I hope you got some real value from this episode. If there's a topic you'd like covered, click on the Beautiful Side of Grief at gmail.com link, or go into the beautifulsideofgrief.com website, where you can also leave a review. To get notified of new episodes, hit the subscribe button. And if you know of somebody who could benefit from this episode, please share. And until next time, please be kind to you and take good care.